Good morning, all. I hope you're able to hear me clearly and the audio is not difficult to fathom. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking time out and attending to this webinar. This webinar was the brainchild of my team more than me. And in this time, in this very difficult time, we were trying to figure out how do we spend our working days in a more meaningful way. And my team came up with a suggestion that why don't we do something which is going to be beneficial for the industry at large. And therefore, my team, and I will take their names one by one, Manat Varej, Krishna Rao, Pragya Avasti, Rishabh Prasad, Dhruv, Toshin, and Samyukta. All of us put together this presentation working from home. This is something in my 25 years I've never done. I've always learned that presentations and speeches are prepared across the table and we kind of huddle together, brainstorm and do all of that thing. But for the first time, we achieved something which we had never done that by remotely working from our locations, trying to do qualitative work which bears some fruit, which bears some meaning, which is valuable to most people who want to view it that way. And these difficult times obviously brings about the best in ourselves. We innovate, we try to come out of difficult times in a manner which is workable. Solutions come out, and in our lives we have seen that at least in the management language, people would say that innovation is the key tool for success. But from those days of innovation, now what comes about is disruption is the new normal. And the economy sees disruption. There are new innovations that disrupt the market. I would believe that this pandemic that has happened has led to an environment of disruption, and it only throws several opportunities for all of us. Opportunities to reskill ourselves, opportunity to relearn, unlearn, opportunities to gear up for the hard times that are likely to come. And at the same time, we are cognizant, all of us are cognizant that worldwide the economy is contracting. The estimate GDP growth for India is not very heartening. I'm told IMF has posted that we are likely to close at 1.8% of GDP. World Bank says no, it's going to be about zero. And there are others who are saying about 3.5, 4% is where we are. Obviously, when there is so much of bloodbath in the market and the economy is tanking and there is a pressure on the margin, there will be a pressure on the margin. Supply chain has come to a halt. The most obvious outcome of all of this is contractual commitments having to take a backseat. Contractual commitments cannot be met. Contractual commitments will become very difficult to be satisfied from the contractee's perspective or counterparty's perspective. And these raises a significant challenge for the industry at large. And today's topic is therefore aimed at attributing some sense to what lies ahead insofar as these contracting challenges are concerned. I must assure you that whatever we are going to speak is not any industry specific in that sense, because there is so much of depth in each of these industries. Probably a 1 hour session will not be adequate to cover. What we have done, therefore, is we have taken a 70,000 feet view of the matter. We are we are considering a few industries to name. We are covering the solar power sector, we are covering the thermal power sector, we are covering the road sector, we are covering the oil and gas sector, we are covering the real estate sector, construction sector, and what have you. But in midst of all of this, I must also put a caveat. Whatever we are going to be presenting are to be looked at in the global perspective. When I say global perspective, not necessarily world perspective, global as in at a larger perspective. Minutiae and specifics of a contract will change, will differ, and therefore you will probably have to go back to your drawing board and look at your own contract. So what it does is give a flavor to what you are likely to expect, the nuances of law, the operating issues that we are likely to see, and some solutions and some suggestions that we are proposing in this whole journey. So today's agenda for you all, can you all organizers, can you confirm if the screen is visible, the presentation is visible?
Presentation is visible, sir.
Excellent.
You can go.
So
Yeah,
here
you
is
can go.
okay. Here is the index for what we have for you. We're going to talk about force majeure and doctrinal frustration, a great deal about it. Then we'll do some bit of sector-specific analysis, and then we'll also talk about a very interesting spin that has come to the picture, which is whether the various guidances, the directives that the government of India and for that matter the various states have issued under the respective legislative framework, whether insofar as lockdown is concerned, whether that can qualify as a change in law. And then some bit of conversation about GST implications on this whole lockdown and COVID-19, some relaxations that the government has done, both the statutory relaxation as also judicial interventions that we have seen, some developments in foreign trade policy which are very interesting, which probably begs some consideration and discussion, and therefore we're going to be talking about. And of course, at the end, we'll talk about the road ahead, what we have for us. Now, the presentation is likely to go on till 12:25. I'll try and complete my conversation with you all by 12:25, and thereafter for the next 15 minutes we'll have a Q&A. As the organizers have mentioned to you, keep your questions for the end so that there is no disruption in the conversation, and that by the last 15 minutes, which will be from 12:25 to 12:40, I'll take as many questions as is possible. So we now move on to our main presentation. Of course, the concept of force majeure is evidently known to most in the industry, whoever has dealt with commercial contracts. But oftentimes we have not seen these events or these clauses ever triggered. And the reason for all of that has been that in the last 25 years that I have at least practiced, we haven't seen any great war that has happened or any epidemic of this kind, or where the economy has been completely brought to a grinding halt of the nature. So those clauses were good to have. Those clauses were hygiene issues. But for the time being, this is probably for the first time, close scrutiny of the concept of force majeure needs to be appreciated, and every lawyer in the team and every commercial contractor in the team will have to go back to their own contracts to appreciate what they have written, and therefore they need to understand the very concept. As a fundamental, force majeure is unique to India. Well, that's not the case. Force majeure exists internationally as well, and the English law had taken a march over the entire concept because as old as in the 1800s, the English law had evolved. And what the judges at that point in time, because most of you are aware that English law is all judgment law, what the judges did at that point in time was to, considering the demands of justice, they read the concept of frustration into those contracts. So contracts were in those days absolute contracts, and then in absolute contracts, if you are not able to perform, specific performance was warranted and damages could be granted. And in a situation where peculiar events had happened which the parties could not contemplate at the time they got into the contract, the judiciary stepped in and said, no, here are situations where it was not in the contemplation of the parties, and it was something that they could not even control, and therefore demand of justice warrants that the contract should be dissolved. The famous case that people often talk about is Taylor versus Calvin and Hirji Murji. These are the cases that are there. These are cases where what had happened, simply put, and I'm just putting some interest to you by giving the facts. What had happened was there was a singer who was asked to perform, and she fell sick. And obviously, if she fell sick, she couldn't have come to the theater, and therefore there were damages for which she was sued. And the courts intervened to say that no, even though there was no escape clause in the contract, because she was sick and she could not comprehend, she could not contemplate that she will fall sick on the day that she had to perform, let the contract be dissolved, because that is what the justice demands. So English law over a period of time has evolved to read escape or concessions from absolute contracts to provide justice to the parties, such that no person is forced to perform something which is impossible or impracticable. So the concept of impossible to perform and impracticable to perform kind of took birth in the English law, and frustration and impossibility were used as terms which were interchangeably adopted in commercial arrangements. What the courts also started doing was they viewed a transaction, or they viewed a contract which was deficient in providing for such an escape clause or a resolution clause, to say what would a reasonable man have done if they had an iota of an idea of what lies ahead, and if they could have contemplated such an event in the future, what kind of recourse would they have gone into? And therefore, the reasonable man test was something that the English courts did introduce in reading an absolute contract into a conditional contract and permitting them to dissolve. The reason I'm making this statement is English law had evolved in the context of the fact that they did not have any codified law. But oftentimes, in our desire to apply English law, we fail to appreciate, and many times people have failed to appreciate, that the Indian context is wholly different. We have a codified law, and in this codified law, at least there are three provisions that needs to be taken cognizance of, and that is for you to appreciate. The first concept is that under section 9, which says that, we know that every promises that is enforceable in law is a contract, but then the promise could be express or implied. And when there is an express promise or an implies promise, in other words, the contract is contingent in a manner such that those events were to happen, only then the contract is valid. And if that contract cannot be that condition cannot be fulfilled, it becomes impossible, then those contracts becomes void. So section 32 is a very important clause before we can go into section 56, because oftentimes people start with section 56, which is the doctrine of frustration, as we all know. But more importantly, section 32 rules the rose. Section 32 has to be first traversed before you can go to section 56. In short, therefore, section 32 deals with the situation that if an event is impossible to perform, then such contracts become void. Separately, insofar as section 56 is concerned, that says that, well, if a contract is illegal ab initio or impossible ab initio, or it becomes subsequently so, then such contracts becomes void. So the nuanced distinction between 32 and 56 is what we need to appreciate, and I'll try to do that in as much clarity as is possible in today's discourse. So what has happened, and having gone through several Indian cases, what comes out very clearly is that in Indian jurisprudence, courts have very limited role to play insofar as the concept of frustration, insofar as a concept of dissolution, insofar as force majeure as a concept is concerned. What essentially happens is, if you have a contract which provides for a manner in which an event of this kind, which is called a force majeure event, has to be dealt with, then you shall be governed by the contractual clause. You have no recourse to section 56 frustration. This is very, very fundamental, which means that as a go-in position for every contract manager, every CEO, every CFO, whoever is controlling, governing, looking at reviewing contracts, you must first exhaust yourself from the perspective of the force majeure clause that the contract pertains or contract provides for. And in that contract, you need to see the exceptions, the coverage, and so on and so forth. So once you are covered by the force majeure clause in the contract, in a legal language, I would say once section 9 read with section 32 is satisfied, there is no role to there is no room to adopt section 56 by any means. The second thing that you need to keep in mind is that if in a contract, two parties have come to a conclusion that yes, X event is a force majeure, but guess what? I am still required to perform the work during the period of such an event, which means there is a waiver, there is an acquiescence and a waiver of a force majeure event agreed to by the party, acknowledging that this is a force majeure event. In that situation, parties have no recourse but to carry on their business as is. And therefore, this is a very important aspect that you need to keep in mind, that was there any waiver or acquiescence that was given in the contract. So these are the two very important aspects that we need to keep in mind before we come to section 56, which everybody talks about, which is the doctrine of frustration. What it essentially says, this section, what it essentially says, that event should not have been contemplated by the parties. Okay, and the event should be such that it strikes at the very root of the performance of the contract, such that it becomes impossible, which means is a fundamental paradigm shift insofar as the performance is concerned, keeping the objective and tenet of what the parties had agreed to. If such a tectonic shift happened, such that the contract is struck at the root, only then and only then that section 56 triggers. The threshold is significant, the burden of proof is very high. Courts will not easily appreciate that a situation falls in a section 56 scenario unless those fundamentals are demonstrated before the court. Now, the term impossibility has been interpreted to mean it does not have to be mere physical impossibility. It does not have to be only literal impossibility. As long as it is impracticable to perform, it would tantamount to impossible. And impracticability is something that the Supreme Court, in several cases, at least in sales tax cases in the past, had adopted many a times. I mean, the case in hand that I remember was whether for procurement of raincoats by a linesman who was standing outside the power generating station to make sure that the electrical lines that went from the busbar to the grid was taut. In other words, that his job was to check whether the patency of the electrical line was perfect. Now, Form C could be used, for those of you who come from sales tax realm would recall that Form C can be used only if it is used in generation or resale. Now, obviously, the raincoats was not used for resale. Raincoat was also not used in generation, because generation, what you use for generation could be coal, fuel, machine, or whatever else. Raincoat was far to remove. This is where the Supreme Court read to say that no, if theoretically generation of power is possible without the raincoat, but practically generation of power is not possible because raincoat is an integral uniform for the linesman. Without the linesman, economically generation of power was just not possible, and therefore the concept or the doctrine of practicability was read into by the Supreme Court long back in the context of sales tax, and this is not new to us. So this notion of impracticability is very important. As you try to apply Section 56 to a situation, keep in mind this concept of impracticability, and we'll talk more about it as we go down the subsequent slides that we have for you. Now, once a contract falls within Section 56 ambit, then there is no need to look into any of the clauses in the contract to figure out whether there was an intention by the parties to deal with it in a certain manner or not. So the priority list or the order of precedence that will be there is, first you look at Section 32 to say whether the contract provides for or does not provide for. Then after you've exhausted 32 and availed the remedy that is available under Section 32, i.e. the contracts, if that is not adequate, satisfactory, whatever else, only and only then will you jump to Section 56 and not before that. So the higher thresholds of Section 56, we need to appreciate that. So as I said, it has to be something which strikes at the very root. Therefore, the language the courts have often used is the event should be such, the situation should be such that it should lead to a radically different outcome. Now, these are esoteric words, radically different situation. Now, what could be radically different situation for one need not necessarily be for the other. So horses for courses, depending upon the nature of the project, nature of the industry, nature of the situation, nature of the trouble that you're facing, the world normative will change. So there is no one size that will fit all to figure out whether it is radically different or not. The second thing is that merely because the performance becomes very onerous, very difficult for you to discharge, does not mean that the contract can be said to be radically different. So difficulty in performance, or howsoever onerous the contract may become, that does not give you a leeway to invoke Section 56. Third is merely because there is a price rise or cost rise, that cannot be said to be a hindrance in performance of a contract. So overall, it's a significant threshold. In fact, I recall a fact from an English law where the Suez Canal was blocked at that point in time, and the ship had to go around the Cape of Good Hope to reach wherever it had to reach. Obviously, those of you who are aware of the geographical limits, Suez Canal was built to make sure there was an easy and fast running of the vessel. And if you go through the Cape of Good Hope, you are actually multiplying your cost by maybe factor of 7, 10, I don't know. And that was pleaded by the party to say that now the cost has become so prohibitive that I cannot even perform the contract, because going through Cape of Good Hope means a lot of money. And the court said, sorry, it doesn't work. Merely because your costs have gone up or your prices are likely to increase, there is absolutely no reason for us to be considering that this is the case for a frustration. This is not a case where the contract has become impossible. You always had an alternate route or alternate method through which you could have discharged the contract. So the criteria, therefore, is, do you have an alternate means to deliver? If you have an alternate means to deliver, then thank you very much, you do not get covered by 56. So three things that you need to keep in mind. A, radically different is dependent upon the fact pattern and the project and the situation where you sit. B, mere cost rise or project costs or prices, etc. Rise does not qualify as hindrance of contract. C, if you have an alternate mode to perform, then sorry, you have no reason to come for section 56. Discharge your contract to that alternate mode. Many of you will face these challenges or this kind of pushback from your contractees or contractors, depending upon whether you are in the position of a subcontractor or a main contractor. These pushbacks therefore need to be appreciated, and that is what we'll try and do in further detail. So section 56, basically to summarize that, if the clause of force majeure is wholly absent in your contract, you can go to section 56. If the clause of force majeure is not applicable to your situation, then certainly you can go to section 56. If the remedy available under section 32, i.e. force majeure clause in your contract, is not adequate enough for you and you're not satisfied that that is actually going to remedy your trouble, then you can go to 56. But like I said, if you choose to go to 56, be prepared for a very high threshold limit to be satisfied before the judiciary, and it is not going to be an easy task. It's going to be a tall task for you to be able to achieve. And typically, when you look at contracts in India that are often available, there are three kinds of ways in which they deal with force majeure. First is that if the period for which the force majeure event goes on is longish, it could be 3 months, 2 months, so what have you, depending upon the contract, it could lead to a discharge of the contract, which means the contract comes to an end. You can say, Tata, and I'm going home. The second is, well, there could be a temporary suspension of the performance of the contract, and we'll talk a lot about it in the subsequent slides. Third is there could be a part performance of the contract. So, okay, fine, so far whatever you've done, I'm happy with that. Thereafter, we are discharging the contract. So you partly performed, you take your money and you go home. So these are the three things that are possible. But having said that, not many people realize that the Contract Act also provides for a concept or a doctrine of remission. A doctrine of remission is provided under section 63, which basically means two parties can come together and say, I am remitting the obligations under the contract in a manner such that even if there is a deficiency of performance, I will say I'm fine with that. For example, let us say the delivery was to be done within 15 days. Delivery of the equipment to site was supposed to be done in 15 days. 15 days is not possible. The parties would have therefore triggered liquidated damages or delay damages, as we call that, because you were supposed to have delivered within 15 days, you're taking more than 15 days. The contractee may say, I'm going to trigger a liquidated damages, but the parties can come together and say, okay, fine, I'm remitting you from your full performance. The 15-day period need not anymore be 15 days. It could be 20 days or 30 days. That is called a doctrine of remission, where the parties come together and remit the performance. So if you find that force majeure is not working out for you, nothing stops you from having a parallel conversation with your project owner or contractor, as the case may be. Can we not trigger section 63? Because at the end of the day, we are partners. A contractor and a contractee are partners. A subcontractor and a contractor are partners. They are partners in a business transaction. And if they both are in a win-win situation, no law stops you from amending it. No law stops anybody from remitting performance. But if in remitting performance, there is a consideration that is taken, then that consideration could just mean a tolerating of a defect, and therefore GST implications do arise. So be careful there. So you may remit performance, but don't remit performance by taking a compensation for the remittent. If you take a compensation, that it becomes a service, and under reverse charge or in the forward charge, depending on which industry you belong, that remission could trigger a service tax liability, a GST liability in today's context, which will fall under the category of tolerating an act. And that tolerating an act is likely to trigger a GST of 18%. So stay clear of taking any compensation for remission. But remission per se, if you can do nothing like it, that is also an alternate solution that you have. Keep in mind that force majeure event can be triggered by either the party. It could be by the contractor, it could be by the contractee. There is no hard and fast rule that only one party can stand up and trigger a force majeure. So either the parties are free to trigger the concept of force majeure in the contract. So when we look at the maze of force majeure clauses that are floating in the commercial world in India, we've kind of scanned through as many that we had in my experience over 25 years. We've kind of jotted down. It is possible that what you will see in the list may not be exhaustive, but then it certainly will give you a flavor of what to expect. So the judiciary is going to read your force majeure clause very, very narrowly. You cannot expect equitable reading of your force majeure clause. In other words, if you do not fit into the literal legis of the contractual language, then do not expect the judges to fill up the gap. Causes omissions will not be supplied by the judiciary in reading a force majeure clause. It will be narrowly construed and very tightly and strictly construed. That's point number one. Point number two, the clauses that you will see, and depending upon which industry you come from, it could have a very specific list of events that qualify as force majeure, or it could have a very general itemized, general indicative circumstances that can qualify as a force majeure, or it could be a combination of generic and specific. Now, generic and specific in interpretation of a generic followed by a specific, or a specific followed by a generis, you use principles of ejus and generis and all of those things. But as you do that, the very object and purpose of the contract will have to be read as a whole. You will not restrict yourself by reading the clauses of force majeure by looking at that one section or one clause dealing with force majeure. The contract will have to be read as a whole. And that is a very fundamental principle, and it's a very old principle of law. Oftentimes the judiciary uses. So don't stop yourself by reading only the force majeure clause. It will have to be read in the context of the larger scheme of things in the contractual format that you have. Sometimes force majeure clause may be inclusive in nature. They may say that force majeure includes a bunch of things. Now, the moment there are a bunch of things which are inclusive, it gives a width to the force majeure clause. So keep that in mind if you have. And they may specifically say, and these are very important, that some force majeure clauses that we have seen, it says that an event could be a force majeure if it is so notified by the project owner or a contractee. So such are the situations where the contractor stands up and notifies the other party that I believe it's a force majeure, then it is a force majeure. Do not expect such a clause to be there in every situation, but I have seen some where such a clause does exist. Interestingly, there are some contracts that I've seen is that making of any Indian legal requirement affecting performance of the parties is also a force majeure. Some contracts have such a clause, which could mean that, for example, the very fact that this notification of lockdown was issued by the government of India, the states came out with various notifications on the epidemic act of the respective states, and they declared certain restraint. Maybe they qualify as an Indian legal requirement. And if such a Indian legal requirement exists, then you can trigger that clause to say, hey, my contract provides that making of an Indian legal requirement which is going to affect the performance of mine is going to be a force majeure. And yes, you will be correct in taking that position. Sometimes some contracts also says, and these are very good contracts, and not many contracts do offer this, which says that if the subcontractor is facing a force majeure event, then the main contractor will also ex facie be permitted to also trigger a force majeure event, because they appreciate that performance by the main contractor is always subject to the adequate and good performance by the subcontractor, because all intertwine into one supply chain. So if the subcontractor is facing a difficulty of force majeure, then automatically it becomes a force majeure for the contractor. But not all contracts will provide that. So look at your contract and see whether you have such an escape clause. The reason I'm making this point is that if you do not have such contracts, then you will have to figure out a way how to bring out those concepts, whether by renegotiation, whether by entering into a fresh contract, or whatever else means that you may have. These are best practices internationally available, and many such documents do echo that concept in India as well. Some contracts, they say that acts and regulations of the government qualify as a force majeure event. Now, very interestingly, act and regulations of the government, by and large, judiciary will read it as to mean anything that qualifies as law under Article 13 of the Constitution of India, which could mean a notification, legislation, act, bylaw, regulation, etc. But what happens to a policy decision? What happens to a policy decision? Can those policy decisions be said to be acts and regulations of the government? Probably not. Probably not, because law will be read, because every contract will have a definition of law in their respective schemes. When you look at the change in law provision, they will have a definition of applicable law or existing law or law as such, and the law definition will never bring in a policy perspective. It may have a clarification issued by the highest government instrumentality and so on and so forth, but a policy document may not be there. So it becomes very interesting to see what is the status of a policy document that comes out, and we'll discuss that in the subsequent slides. But I just wanted to park this point in your mind that while acts and regulations of the government can qualify as a force majeure event in some contracts, question that begs our consideration is whether a policy decision will also qualify as an act of regulation. We'll talk about it. Act of gods are often included in many of the force majeure clauses. So far as those contracts are concerned, act of god has been interpreted in many jurisdictions to include an epidemic of any kind. So this is something that comes out very beneficial to industry, that you can use act of god as a tool to trigger a force majeure, if you will. Some contracts we have seen that not only act of god, they have a specific reference to epidemic. Well, if it has a specific reference to epidemic, for sure you have no reason to be worrying about. So whether you have an epidemic or an act of God, either which way, you are fairly covered insofar as this COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. Some contracts provide for specific exclusions. Now, those have to be very carefully looked at. The exclusions often creates trouble. In a very celebrated decision of the Supreme Court in the context of the in Indonesian coal supply, one of the key reasons where the parties could not succeed in invoking Section 56 or the likes was that there was a specific exclusion that if there was an increase in cost of supply of fuel, plant and machinery, etc., it will not tantamount to force majeure. Now, this is something that you will often see in a thermal power project or a large contracts or EPC contracts or large PPAs of thermal power projects. But if you have any contract where you see such exclusion clauses, beware of those exclusions and try to see how you want to deal with it. There are ways to deal with it, which we'll talk about. Some contracts also says that delay in performance by a subcontractor or down the chain will be an exclusion. So we saw earlier slide that if there is a force majeure event of a subcontractor, ex facies becomes a force majeure clause for the contractor. That is a very good clause. But we have also seen extreme positions where they say that merely because subcontractor is facing a delay or because of force majeure does not discharge the contractor from his performance, and therefore it will not be a force majeure. So a completely diametrically opposite situation. So beware of such situations, whether you fall into what kind of basket. The point I'm trying to make is there is no one size that fits all. Point I'm trying to make is that everybody, different industries will have to behave differently, will have to deal with differently. You may take the learnings from one industry to the other, but your journey is your own. Your fight is your own. Your fight is restricted to the tenets of the contract that you have bargained. Any difference of the contractual terms vis-a-vis your competition is not going to be a reason for you to cry Hail Mary before the contractee and ask for concessions. So be clear about that. What you negotiated, what you have sowed is what you will reap, and therefore specifics of your contract will have to be seen. An interesting aspect also comes about if there is a default committed by the contractor. Let's say he should have supplied an equipment to site by, let's say, December of 2019. For some reason or the other, he did not. And suddenly come February, there is this pandemic that has come about. Can he come back to the owner and say, look, I am being delayed because of force majeure, and therefore please give me a further extension under the force majeure clause? In other words, can you take advantage of your deficiency in performance, and the deficiency started much prior to the force majeure event having been triggered? Can you take an advantage of that? The answer is no, you will not. And the reason for that is, if you see, merely because an event is a force majeure does not warrant that you'll get benefits under the contract. Those events will have to be also such that you meet 2-3 other parameters, and that's how most of them are defined. That the event should be such that it happened under the circumstances which was beyond your reasonable control. So if the delivery was within your control, certainly by December, and if not having done that, today you can't come back and say, I want to trigger a force majeure. So any deficiency or any act or action which was within your control, reasonable control, then if that happens, then you have no defense of force majeure that you can invoke. And the other thing that they say, most contracts will say that it should be unavoidable despite you taking reasonable care and prudent utility practice. So a prudent utility practice or reasonable care is something that you will have to, you certainly could have done by December for sure, and not having done that does not give you a leeway to come back to the owner or the contractor, as the case may be, to say, I want to trigger a force majeure. But the real debate that will happen is, assuming for a fact that you are covered in an epidemic and therefore you can say COVID-19 is a force majeure event. But before you can trigger that, you have to meet the qualitative tests, as I said, of it being beyond your reasonable control, of you having taken reasonable care or prudent utility practice, and yet you are not able to perform. These three thresholds of prudent utility practice, reasonable care, is a very, very subjective thing. Half of the battle, half of the challenge will be to satisfy the counterparty that you actually took a prudent utility practice. We have seen arguments in the industry in the context of safeguard duty. I can tell you that import from China, solar modules from China triggers a safeguard duty. The counterparties had come up before the courts. Of course, those were repelled. Counterparties had come up before the court that what stopped you from bringing the solar modules from other country from where safeguard duty was not levied. Prudent utility practice would warrant that you shift your supply chain from China to some other country. Why did you not do that? A duty to care was there for you to make sure that the project cost does not go up, or for that matter, the consumers are not affected. So they have gone to the extent in safeguard duty litigations before the courts to say that prudent utility practice should be adopted. Now, while those are repelled in the context of safeguard duty for specific reasons, which we did not go into today, but I will expect, and you can expect, that in conversations with your contractees or counterparties, as the case may be, this prudent utility or reasonable care as a factorial or a parameter or satisfaction of these two esoteric words, subjective words by the contractee or the counterparty is going to be a huge challenge, and you have to be bracing up for that. And therefore, we need to take your stock on how do you establish these two attributes have been satisfied. Moving on. So these are the five key conclusions that comes about insofar as force majeure events are concerned. If force majeure if force majeure clause does not contemplate epidemic, then for sure you can go for a resolution by saying that my contract cannot be performed because it has struck at the root, subject to that factor being met. If force majeure clause contemplates epidemic but expressly states that notwithstanding parties should continue to work, I don't expect any such contract will exist. But if so, in case there is any such weird outre contract that may be there, then you can certainly go for dissolution of contract, but that is not going to be possible because the parties have kind of acquiescent to that, and the court will say, hey, you knew about it very well, you decided to waive it, and therefore that is where you rest. You can't come to 56. Force majeure clause contemplates epidemic and permits extension of time. You can still go to 56. Mind you, 56 can still be gone into if it becomes impracticable. The solution that is provided for in the force majeure clause, if that is not acceptable to you, that is going to be such that it breaks your back to an extent that it strikes at the root and the fundamentals of the contract, then you can still approach the court for a force majeure situation. Force majeure clause specifically excludes an event as force majeure. For sure, you can come to section 56. In short, therefore, first you go to your contract, see what solutions are there, see whether those solutions are workable for you. If it is workable for you, that's perfect, nothing like it. You move on in life and then carry on with business as usual. If that is not workable, if and only if that is not workable, or the contract is completely silent on how to deal with it, only in these situations you go to section 56, call for a frustration. But mind you, as I said, if you go for section 56, you have to be very, very clear that you will face a significant challenge of having to show that the fundamentals of the contract have kind of shaken. We move down. The other thing which is very important, which I spoke about, the government directives. What happens to government directives? What happens to those? Are they a contract? Can they override? Because keep in mind, private contracts, privately negotiated, government should not intervene. But then the point to be noted is when the government comes out with any directive, and most of the directives which we will see, most of the directives very clearly has come out in the form of an office memorandum. I would believe an office memorandum issued by any of the agencies are nothing short of being public policy. A public policy is a very important tool in governance of the country. And section 23 of the Contract Act says that if any contract is contrary to public policy, then such contract will become void. In other words, if a contract says that you have a force majeure during this period, but the government has said no, you can't stop production, you have to carry on because you are an essential industry. Therefore, there is a conflict between the contractual clause and the government directive. If you go against the government directive, then Of course, you may not making a contractual breach, but your contract will become in breach of a public policy. And any breach that takes place against public policy will make the contract void. And if you're forced to live in a situation where the contract is void, then you can ask for a compensation from the counterparty by virtue of section 65 of the Indian Contract Act, that if any person takes advantage of out of a contract that is void, compensation shall follow. So be clear about that. Be very sensitive about each of the public directives that have come from the various government agencies in terms of whether force majeure clause will prevail or the government directives will prevail. So sector specific, I'll quickly run through. So for the solar power plants, for solar power PPAs, we have seen various kinds of various models that are floating around. In some cases, epidemic is identified as a force majeure. In some cases, epidemic is not identified, but act of God is identified. Like I said, if neither of the two words are there, you can certainly go under section 56, doctrine of frustration, or you can go for a remission under section 63 of the Contract Act by mutual negotiation. The scenarios that we have seen is in the first scenario, we see that force majeure provides for suspension for both the parties, and there will be no default. That's the standard go to have situation. The second are obligation to supply power not suspended, but power purchaser can suspend drawal of power. That has happened. Now, keep in mind that the MNRE had issued directives to say that so far as solar plants are concerned, solar generators are concerned, the DISCOMs are bound to pick up power unless the exception of a grid failure can be pleaded by them. In other words, given the fact that the government has said that these are all must-run industry, all the generating stations and the power stations are all must-run stations, the DISCOMs cannot say that I will not pick up power because I don't have consumers. The reason that the government is saying that, well, these are very small players and you might as well pick up the power, they're also saying, and the exception that they're given is grid failure. If you can show grid failure, then certainly you can say I will not pick up the power. The second thing that the government has said in their directive is that, look, because this DISCOMs have been given a moratorium for making payments to the generators when it comes to the thermal power plants, and renewable energies forms a very small quantum of the overall energy basket. Please make sure that the DISCOMs, DISCOMs are directed that they should make payments to the generators on time. If they fail to do that, then they will be liable to pay a surcharge, late payment surcharge, but that surcharge rate has also been reduced from 1.5% per month to 1%. So therefore, the government is trying to bridge the gap, the expectation between the developer, the SPDs and the DISCOMs specifically. Some cases we saw that if you want to trigger a force majeure, you need to go to the commission. That's quite bizarre, because such of those PPAs where you have to go to the commissioner, God save you, because we know for a fact that once it goes to a commission, there will be pleadings, and then there will be replies and rejoinders, then hearings and whatever else. And time is of essence in this kind of situation. So you will be subject to a significant amount of bottlenecks to get your force majeure situation sorted out because of the judicial intervention that is contemplated. Some say that, well, if there are payments that are due prior to the force majeure event coming to force, then all those payments will have to be clearly met out, and you cannot take a refuge to force majeure event not to pay. Some says that there will be an extension that is available, but of course you have to make your request within a stipulated period of time. But keep in mind, now when I talk about the solar PPAs, similar flavor can be seen in a construction PPA, construction contracts as well, or a concession agreement with NHIs of the world as well. Notification to the owner could be very vital. If you miss that time period, then God save you. So be very clear about the timeline that may be prescribed within the documents that you are dealing with. Some contracts, some PPAs say that if the force majeure event stays on for 4 to 6 months, and some it could be lesser, it could be a little bit higher, whatever it is, so long as it stays on for a significant period of time as defined in the contract, the parties can say, okay, fine, we are closing shop, and therefore let's say goodbye to this project, and the resolution can be granted contractually as well. But if it is silent, if a contract is silent, it does not provide for an exit, even though the force majeure event has gone beyond the normative 4 to 6 months, if I were to use that word, then please don't lose heart. You can still look at a section 56 route. But then if you look at the 56 route, as I told you, a higher threshold of radically different and striking at the root and all of this will have to be satisfied. That you can if you have the fact pattern in your favor. Construction guidelines, keep in mind what the MNRE has said, and this applies to the entire industry, not only the solar, it could be to every industry. There are two events that have happened place which are disrupting business. First is the COVID effect worldwide. China is an example, but it could be worldwide. Italy has also got affected, US has got affected, the entire humanity has been affected by this thing. So epidemic is one force majeure event. Lockdown is another force majeure event. It may be a consequent to that, but it is also an independent force majeure event, because the lockdown may operate differently, and lockdown may have a different effect to different industries. Some industries are must-run situation, therefore lockdown may not theoretically apply to them. Some cases are within the non-essential category, and therefore lockdown applies to them wholly. So you will, when you look at force majeure, don't look at COVID-19 as the only force majeure. You have an epidemic as one force majeure event, and a consequent of that could also be the lockdown that the government has directed, and therefore you may look at a combination of these two to come out with some kind of an offer to the counterparty. Keep that in mind. Now, what the government has done is these are self-explanatory. So far as COVID-19 China is concerned, because of China is concerned, they had said, okay, fine, you can trigger it as a force majeure event, but significant evidences will have to be submitted by you to prove that your supply chain was disrupted because of that. But then when it came to lockdown, the government said, no, you don't have to give any proof. We accept the fact that because of lockdown there was there was a certain satisfaction by the government that yes, your supply chain was disrupted, therefore it becomes ipso facto a force majeure event. You don't have to prove anything, and they gave a time period of whatever the period of lockdown is, from the start date of middle of March until about, let's say, 3rd of May, assuming it gets off by that time. They're saying that beyond that 30 days will be given. Now I have a question: is 30 days good enough? Is 30 days good enough for us, or should it not have been more than 30 days? How do you even quantify that? What is the period during which the lockdown should be considered, or during which the force majeure event should be considered? Now, if the directive says 30 days, does not necessarily mean that you're restricted to 30 days, because all those directives are in the form of may. They may, because these are all facilitative and enabling clauses in the contractual situation, in the contractual world. It does not say that. It is not like a tax law where this has to be read strictly. So I would believe that with certain amount of cajoling with your counterparties, you can probably figure out a timeline which kind of fits the bill, which is win-win for both the parties. Don't get disheartened by these 30 days alone. So that's one part. Like I said, this MNRE directive that has come on this lockdown, etc. The question that comes out is whether it is going to be binding on the state regulation or state agencies, because they need not necessarily follow the MNRE directive. So therefore, the binding nature of that could be a suspect, and those discoms, the state coms, so to say, if they were to follow their own methodology, they may say that, well, it was an advisory, but I'm not sure that I need to follow that. So that's going to be a tug of war that you may see in the overall context. I have already spoken about the MHA guidelines, this must-run status of electricity, so therefore I need not go into that. I'll quickly move to thermal. Pretty much follows the solar, except that thermal has far more exhaustive and detailed clauses. That is where it rests, and no new point that comes out that needs to be relevant. Okay. Oil and gas sector, very clearly, very important that you have to keep in mind that some of the production sharing contracts that are there in the government MOPNG website says that even if it is a force majeure situation, your statutory payment obligations continue to subsist, which means if you have to pay a royalty, if you have to pay a surface rent, if you have to pay a dead rent, you have to continue to pay, and there will be no escape from that. Of course, look at your PSCs and see whether that restrictive covenant is there or not. But the standard documentation does provide that these statutory payments will have to be paid, and therefore as soon as you pay that, the tax, various obligations come into effect, the tax liabilities, etc., etc. They don't talk about an termination as such. They talk about parties will meet and discuss the consequences of that. So escape need not be automatic. It could be subject to negotiation between the parties. Real estate sector, two very important points that you have to keep in mind. If there is a force majeure clause, you will be bound by that force majeure clause, no difficulty. But if you are not covered by the force majeure clause, you have a very, very onerous responsibility or discharge under Section 108 of the Transfer Property Act. And that says that it should be an irresistible force, no difficulty in that you can satisfy. But the qualifying criteria is that it should be such that it substantially and permanently makes the property unfit. Now, that is a significant threshold. That is a significant challenge for you to be able to meet that criteria. So if you have a lease agreement where there is no FM clause, you have no choice but to go to Section 108 of the Transfer Property Act. Sale of land, if there is anybody interested, I can tell you that sale of land in India, you can trigger a Section 56, but of course you have to see whether the contract did provide for time is of essence. Because if time was not of essence, then the other side can say that, well, you could have waited for another 3 months and then delivered to me. How can you say that? How can you renege the contract today even when the time limit has not been exhausted? Highways, ports, highways, I looked at some standard NHAI contract concessions, etc., that were there. We found that they have this concept of non-political event as a force majeure clause. And there is a very interesting covenant that they put that whatever, while it may fall within the force majeure event, but all of that should lead to material adverse effect to the project. Now, like I said, material adverse effect to the project is again a subjective word. Prudent utility impact is another subjective word. Overcome such act despite due diligence, reasonable effort, skills is a subjective word. So while theoretically you may trigger your force majeure clauses, but practically to be able to implement that, you'll have to go through these clauses to satisfy the counterparty that you've done, that the situation is such that it leads to material adverse effect and so on and so forth, and every contract will have. So now, since I'm almost through with my time frame, I'll come to the last clause. I'm sorry I couldn't finish my presentation. Much I would have loved to do all of that. I'll come to the last slide.
Sir, you can take 10 more minutes to cover the PPT. Okay.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So then give me another minute or so. Let me go back to my slides. Okay, just prompt me when I have to stop. Okay, so we spoke about that. Okay, now this is a very interesting topic that comes out, that can force majeure be invoked despite must-run status that have been prescribed for. Now, the government may, in the interest of the people at large, in public interest, may have said that yes, these utilities are must-run. Whether it's a power generation, whether it's transmission, whether it is telecom, whether it is oil and gas operation, there are a whole host of things that have been said that must run. But can such directive overwrite an impracticable situation where a contractor or a generator says, I am not able to generate anymore, or the telecom operator says, I am not able to operate anymore because my backend has collapsed? And what is backend? Backend could mean I don't have any operator available, my labor is not available, there's a breakdown of a heavy equipment, I cannot repair it because the suppliers are not available, any other thing that is beyond my control. So yes, I am ready and willing to deliver, but my backend has shut down because of that. And therefore, can the government then say, no, you still have to go on? I would believe that would be completely inequitable, because the very purpose of force majeure clause is to give relief to such situations. So in that situation, where the directive of the government may seemingly appear to be a in public interest, and violation of a public interest could make a contract void, but the impracticability of a contract of that nature, or impracticability of the performance of that nature, you can certainly go to the court under 56 and ask for a dissolution of the contract, saying that my fulcrum of the whole contract has fallen. Alternatively, any public policy which is arbitrary, any public policy that is unreasonable, can certainly be challenged before the writ court. So if you want to take that route is also available, because merely because it's a public policy does not mean it is a gospel truth. The Supreme Court decisions on that is very clear. A public policy that is unreasonable, arbitrary, Wednesbury principles are not satisfied, and so on and so forth, it is contrary to the Constitution, etc., can certainly be challenged. So you still have that route that keep in mind. In short, don't be worried that you have been forced to a must-run situation, but you're not able to operate. There are escapes that can be looked at. Then we spoke about this. We don't need to go into this. We have spoken about oil and gas. Okay, in oil and gas sector, some of the sale purchase agreements of products, it could be a crude, it could be whatever else that you can consider. What we have seen is that if the party has delivered the goods to the buyer, then many of the contracts clearly say that the buyer cannot renege payment. The buyer cannot at that point and say, no, force majeure, I don't have the money and I cannot pay you. So therefore, complete obligation to discharge payment to the counterparty is warranted, even in a force majeure situation, even if that may be triggered. That's one. Second is they have interestingly a clause that force majeure event will start from the date of commencement of the event and not from the date when you give the notice. So it has a retroactive effect. Some contracts do not say that. Some contracts say that from the date of notification, when you notify the other party, force majeure will happen. So be careful whether you have such a clause or not. And then the contracts can be terminated as we notice. Unlike in the other situation, the MOPNG situation, where we saw that parties can renegotiate. So we spoke about the MOPNG production sharing contracts. I will skip that. There, the force majeure event is about natural phenomena. I would believe that epidemic is a natural phenomena. It is certainly not man-made. Of course, there is some school of thought that says that it probably came from some lab in some part of the world. But keeping that aside, that aside, I think it is a natural phenomena, and we can certainly take a refuge to that. We spoke about the real estate sector. Ports and highways, we spoke about. Okay, in highways, what we noticed was very interestingly, they have non-political event, as I said. Then they have, if the force majeure event is before financial closure, then a certain attribute, certain method in which it has to be dealt with. Then they said if it is after the financial closure, but before COD, commercial operation date, then it will have to be in a certain manner. If it is post-commercial operating date, then they say that, look, you still endeavor to collect the toll. If you can't, then of course we'll look at it. So the force majeure, the flavor of the benefits of force majeure clause in a concession agreement, by and large, with an NHAI contract, depends on the time at which you are. If you are at a pre-commissioning stage, pre-financial closure stage, it will have a different flavor. Post-financial closure, pre-COD, it will have different, and so on and so forth. So like I said, there is no one size that fits all. So action point for industries, which is what I want to come back to. Quickly, I'll take you to that before I come to the tax clauses, tax clauses I can run you. I don't need the slides to be able to, because those are nuanced. It doesn't need to be gone into. So here are the action points. Yes. So industry at large, you will have to start mapping your supply chain on a project by project basis. Okay, because remember, different project will react differently because of the supply chain could be wholly different. Then you have to identify the critical fault lines that you have in the supply chain. Where is the bottlenecks? Which supply chain is getting affected the most? Because time is of essence for you. You can't hold battle in every front. You'll have to prioritize. There will have to be a pragmatic approach to the entire thing, because if you're dealing with multiple contracts, remember, you have the subcontractors also who are going to hound you. Just as you want to hound your counterparty, your subcontractors will also hound you. How many fronts will you open in such a short span of time? So therefore, you have to prioritize, identify the critical fault lines. You have to isolate the disrupted trade flows and examine the contractual effects. So you have to first take those isolated cases, and then, isolate all the problematic things, and then isolate them case by case, contract by contract, to figure out what lies beneath. And therefore, doing all of that, your cash flow management or cash flow evaluation of your situation, both on the cost side and revenue side, will have to be looked at, because waging a war of this nature will have to be, like I said, prioritized, and therefore your cash flows become very important for you. If you can forego some and put your battle in some other, it is better. So don't open all the gates. Be very focused on that. Then you do a detailed analysis of the contractual force majeure reliefs and preconditions for their invocation, and that you should do on the front side as well as on your cost side. If there are imperatives that you have to be satisfying for both the parties, you'll have to do that. You have to inventorize the contract by contract compliances and documentation. Some, like I said, some ask you to go to the commission, some ask you to go put a notice, some says that okay, fine, it will have a retroactive effect. So yeah, every contract will have different, so you have to inventorize that. You have to identify the end and start date of the force majeure, and if it is not acceptable to the counterparty, does not mean that you have to accept it. That is where you have to get into a hard negotiation, because reality is that the test is going to be impracticability of performance, non-performance as an event, as an eventuality of that, and therefore a root cause analysis will have to be kind of meshed into this overall force majeure claim. You have to identify where pre-force majeure, the contracting party, whether you are in default or not. Be careful. Those cases, you should not even spend your energy there, because that's likely to be a pushback that you'll get. Examine if there is any conflict with the government directive. And this is where I think a lot of energy needs to be spent, that oftentimes you will find that the government directive, whether it's from the MNRE, whether from the MHA, whether lockdown, whether COVID, whether in the central government giving it advisory to the state government, is going to run in conflict with your contractual clauses. And that conflict need not necessarily be in favor of one of the parties. At least it may be in favor of the other party. So how do you deal with that seeming conflict is something that we have to look at. We have to keep in mind section 23, public policy, whether it is a public policy or not a public policy, and so on and so forth. Those larger issues we have to be keeping in mind. If force majeure is not inapplicable or applicable, you think that, well, dissolution is the only way out. Now this extension does not give me any joy, because I don't think I'm going to be able to perform. And I've seen situations where the land could not be procured because of the land went into litigation with the government. And then how long do you wait for that? Can you wait for ad nauseum? No, the answer is no. And therefore the project economics or the tariff or the project bid price that you factored was based on a certain amount of economic parameter at the beginning of the project. If all of those goes for a toss and the project becomes unviable, not necessarily only increase in price or cost, if it becomes unviable from other thresholds, then certainly you can look at exiting from the contract. And in that situation, focus will be on meeting the preconditions of section 56. So there's a lot of homework that needs to go into that. Identify the key foundational aspects of the contract, erosion of which would strike at the root, because because you know your contract best. No lawyer will be able to tell you. You will be able to tell, you will be able to identify, these are the fulcrum of my contract, the pedestal on which the contract kind of lies, and therefore if there is any shake in any one of them, it's likely to cause an earthquake, so to say. Therefore you identify them. Identify if the contract had an essence of contract. Please keep in mind, essence of contract is if time is of essence of contract, it is very, very important to be kept in mind, because this COVID, for all you know, is not going to be a lifelong thing. God forbid that it is going to be like that. I would believe that the 3 months, 4 months is when it is going to die out. And if the time is not of essence of a contract and you are able to push it further, then this may not become a force majeure situation. You can always wait. Parties can wait. So figure it out whether time is of essence in the contract or not, and prepare a roadmap and a timeline for engaging with counterparties. That strategy has to be there. So therefore these are the things that you have to keep in mind. Coming quickly into the tax, three things are very important. First, there are many supply chains that you'll see in these presentations where the truck may have, you may have removed the goods from the factory. It has been loaded onto the truck. The truck went about 10 kilometers and then suddenly it was stopped at the checkpost. It couldn't reach the destination. In other words, the goods could not be delivered. The fact is, in such situation, your GST point of tax has already triggered. The trigger point was removal from the factory. Trigger point was not delivery to the customer or raising of an invoice or receipt of the goods by the customer or receipt of payment. So there will be many instances, and the slides have all of those details. For paucity of time, I will not be able to go through that. There will be many transactions where taxable event and your point of tax has already got triggered. You're obliged to pay the tax, but the obligation to pay the tax in all those situations is a function of when you file your Form 3B. And the good part is the government has, I wouldn't say extended, the government has said that for the month of February, March and April, the GSTR 3B can be filed late. But if you file late, but that too within a defined period of time, then the interest that is payable for delayed payment will not apply to all those cases whose turnover in the preceding financial year was less than 5 crores. But for those people whose turnover was in excess of 5 crores, the rate of interest has been reduced significantly to 9%, which means, keep in mind, that it is probably better to file your GSTR 3B on time despite the lockdown, if you can remotely, failing which you are still required to pay an interest, although at a lower rate of 9%. But even 9% is a very high rate given the fact the savings rate of the government is significantly low. 9% is a heavy cost. But I asked a question to myself, and it's for all of you to also examine. Why is it that the government says anybody that is in excess of 5 crore, you will pay a 9% interest, but anybody below 5 crore, you will not pay an interest? Why is it happening? Are they applying the concept of the canon of taxation, which is called a vertical equity? A vertical equity is the higher your paying capacity, higher your rate of tax. So super rich will pay more tax, and the poor will pay a lesser tax. That applies in income tax for sure, the vertical equity. Why should the vertical equity as a concept apply to interest? Because interest is compensatory in nature. Interest does not go by who had default. Interest is all about the government not getting their money on time, and therefore the government needs to be compensated. So what is the object that they are trying to seek? Is there a rational basis in which this intelligible differential can be satisfied? To my mind, there is none. And this whole thing of the government trying to put a 9% on anybody above 5 crore and that below 5 crore, not a single paisa of interest, seem to be arbitrary, and therefore that can be challenged, if you will. But larger issue is that for February, March, and April, if you file your GST 3B on time as per law, then not an interest. But if you go by the extended date that they've spoken about, then 9% interest will apply. But for the month of May, they have actually extended the period for which the GST 3B should be filed, which means that if you file by the revised due date that the government has given, you don't pay an interest at all. So that's one important aspect. The second thing that has to be kept in mind in GST is not GST, foreign trade policy. Very interesting. The FTP has been extended. 1520 FTP, foreign trade policy 1520, has been extended to 2021, which is 1 year extension has been given in the midst of all of this. Surprisingly, when it comes to SEIS scheme, served from India scheme, service exporter from India scheme, what they say is that all the exports that you have done in the preceding financial year, which is 1920, for that the benefits I will identify through a notifications later, and the services that will qualify for those benefits is also something that I'll advise later. Which means today, all the exports made 1920, you're not even aware what benefits, which services will get the benefit for the year 2020, 2021. And the government says that the further notification at that point in time, I will prescribe who will get the benefit and so on. So which means that the notification of what benefit, who will get the benefit of SEIS will effectively have a retroactive effect, because it will go back in time to 1920. Now, the provision of amendment under foreign trade policy is there under section 5. That says that amendment can be made from time to time. The phrase time to time has been read by the Delhi High Court and the Supreme Court, Justice Sinha's judgment, where they say that it will only be prospective in nature. So therefore, any amendment that is retrospective, or I would argue to say if any amendment that is retroactive, will fall foul of the very notification making power under section 5, and therefore this SEI scheme seems to be this provision, this amendment seems to be suspect, and therefore that can be looked at as a good ground for a challenge, especially by the industry who had done the export in 1920. A couple of words about your obligations from an interim orders and so on and so forth. The Supreme Court has stepped in. They have given order under Article 142, very clearly saying that if 15/3/2020, all cases where the limitation expires after that day, there will be an automatic extension of the limitation period, notwithstanding whatever the Limitation Act may say. So therefore, your appeals and your petitions, whatever it is that you may have, all of that gets automatically extended. The directive of the Supreme Court is available. Please do that at leisure. So therefore, you have a comfort. And not only that, various high courts have come out with their details of the interim orders that were prevailing, which have been automatically extended. But of course, the only thing is different high courts, different dates, and those dates are also soon expiring. In many cases, likely to expire in the next couple of days or maybe 10 days or so. So those local bar will keep on asking for extensions. But be very careful. Some of those things will automatically get extended. The board has issued directive to various implementing agencies. Board, as in the CBIC, has given the directive to the authorities that you go slow on some of those things. Some of the implementation will be slow. Your hearings, etc., all of that can be kept in abeyance, and so on and so forth. So, in summary, therefore, your compliances are not so much distraught, but you have to be very smart about it. You don't want to get into a compliance where you end up paying interest. So therefore, keep an eye on that. Some of the amendments that have happened in the foreign trade policy is a suspect that can be a subject matter of challenge. Interim orders, you don't need to worry about it. You don't need to crowd the court by going there. But your contractual defense of force majeure or going to 56 requires a lot of study. You'll have to do a lot of homework sitting at home or wherever you can, or as soon as all of you reconvene. Get onto that business and start having a conversation with your counterparties as soon as possible. Thank you very much for for listening to me. I'll be happy to take questions. Audience can send their questions to me.
Sir, questions are there in the question section.
Yeah, I'm trying to open. How do I see the questions? I'm quite tech challenged. Can you tell me the icon where I can see the questions?
सर एक क्वेश्चन लिखा हुआ है ना यहाँ पर, you have to click that, and on the before cross there is one sign to expand that. So the question
I have
will get
expanded
expanded.
it. Attendees questions. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's see what is the question. So question that I've got is, first question that has been asked is, in cases of commercial leases, when there is no force majeure clause, should section 56 be invoked for the answer is no. As I said, for commercial leases, section 56 cannot be invoked of the Contract Act. You have to go to section 108 of the Transfer Property Act, because that is a specific provision that deals with it. And that says that unless the property becomes unfit for utilization, unfit for the purposes, and that threshold is very high. So you can't go to section 56 at all. Any other question? Just one sec. Okay, in cases of commercial leases, I've looked into that. Okay, so in case commercial leases, there is no force majeure clause. I've seen that. Or is it mandatory to resign the entire contract? Well, you can't resign the entire contract, because how do you resign the entire contract? That they will ask for a specific performance. You can't resign the contract just like that. The only way you can resign is under section 56, and section 56 does not apply to you. So therefore, the only way you can resign is under 108 of the Transfer Property Act, because keep in mind that Transfer Property Act deals with leases. Okay. I haven't got any other question yet.
So there are many questions. आपने questions पे click किया था सर? जो chat के नीचे लिखा हुआ है questions. Harinder, can you help in
I
this?
haven't got. I can see only one question, unless I'm missing out something. I don't know. Would the PPT be shared? Somebody has asked this question. Yes, the PPT will be shared. Not an issue at all. What else? Okay. So PPT will be shared. Not an issue at all. I'm receiving some private messages, of course, on my phone, but it seems that people are not raising it in the forum. So those of you who are asking me private questions, I will certainly talk about it as soon as I get off the call or this video. But I would encourage you all to ask the questions here if you can, and so that everybody can take benefit of that. While questions are as they start coming in, I had some other thoughts as well, which I thought may be useful for you to keep in mind. You know, the issue, while I have dealt with the infrastructure sector in general, or the energy sector in general, I'm likely to see, or you will all likely to see, a significant larger dimension of this issue in the aviation sector. Several aircrafts are on ground. They are on ground across the world. All airlines have been shut by domestic, international, by all the countries. There are engines that have been taken on lease, and those engine leases will have to be paid ordinarily. And in those situations, force majeure clause becomes so relevant, because the fellow is not able to pay, because we know for a fact, as long as an aircraft is on ground, aviation company is going to be bleeding. And therefore, engine leases, or even the metal lease, so to say, if I were to use that jargon of the industry, lease of metal or lease of engine is going to have a havoc in the force majeure regime, and therefore those lawyers will have to actually huddle together and get done with it, and frustration. And there is a interesting complication with that. Those contracts need not necessarily be governed by Indian laws. If somebody has signed a contract which has French law there, or Irish law, what have you, then you have to look at the dimension not only from the Indian Contract Act, but also from the Contract Acts or the laws of contract or the English judgments or whatever else applies in those jurisdictions. So it gets that much more complicated. And aside of that, the aviation sector will also see another dimension of that. The MRO sector, which is the maintenance, repair, overhaul, or ROH, repair, overhaul, all of those are also based on, the payments are made on a per flight hour. And if there are no flying hours that are happening, what payments will go to those companies? Because they have kind of this based on a certain amount of actuary. You kind of look at the flying time of the aircraft or the engine possible, and then you spread it over a period of time, you amortize the cost and do all kinds of crazy computations, and then you come to a certain number. And therefore your dynamics and economics are based on that kind of broad spread. And if the per flight hour is not triggering because the aircraft is not off the ground, it is on the ground, what payments will you make? So the MRO companies are going to be, and down the chain, everybody is going to be also suffering, the LRU suppliers. So aviation sector, whether you look at the maintenance side or even the general aviation, which is flying from point A to point B, or scheduled airlines, they're going to have a crazier difficulty, to my mind. So that's one sector that we need to be very, very careful about. If there are any parties from the aviation sector, please brace up, because there will be a lot of bloodbath there as well.
So there are many questions lined up. If you can check.
Okay, there are questions lined up.
Right.
How do I see? I mean, this is so.
So जहाँ पे questions लिखा हुआ है.
Yes, I see
वहाँ पे
that.
जहाँ पे क्रॉस है, क्रॉस से पहले जो एक विंडो है उसको आप क्लिक करेंगे ना, तो इट विल अपीयर, क्वेश्चन विल अपीयर क्रॉस से बिल्कुल पहले.
Cross will people show unanswered question. Okay. Okay, it's so small that I'm not able to see it actually.
So can I read like couple of
yeah, read out. Okay, yeah, read out the questions. I'm not able to see them, unfortunately. It's so slow in the font.
A question है, considering that the difficulty in executing the contract is due to the lockdown and not because of COVID-19 per se. That being the case, can it still be called an act of God?
No. Lockdown is not an act of God. Okay, but keep in mind, lockdown could fall under any directive of the government such that performance becomes impossible. Many contracts do have such a clause. Point one. Point two, lockdown is a consequence of epidemic. So if there are many force majeure clause which says XYZ is an epidemic or XYZ is a force majeure, and any event which is a consequence of that is also a force majeure. So in those contracts where the consequential benefit is also given, lockdown can fall under that. Those contracts where the consequential benefit is not provided for, you can say that lockdown is a government act. Okay, if that contract provides for, and such contracts where neither of the two are provided for, then you have to be very careful. You have to see your specifics, and I'm assuming that none of the clauses help you. Then you will have to have no choice but to go to section 56 frustration and see if you can build your case bottoms up by saying that the very fulcrum and the very core of the contract has been lost. Okay, I got another question. Whether DISCOMs can invoke force majeure clause to avoid payment of fixed charge for must-run power plants which have PPAs. Well, the directive from, I'm assuming this question, I don't know whether it's from PPA, solar or renewable energy, or from the thermal or conventional. If it is from the renewable energy, the directive of MNRE is very clear. Whether it doesn't make a distinction between fixed or any other, okay? It says that you shall make payments because you have anyway got a moratorium insofar as larger payments to the thermal power is concerned or conventional power is concerned. So therefore, if there is a directive of the MNRE and there is there is a specific directory that has been given, that directive is from to SECI as well as to NTPC. So those are the counterparties in those PPAs, that I don't believe they can renege that. And if they do that, then most certainly we can take recourse under the dispute resolution clauses that are there in the contract. Okay.
And there is another question. Could you please clarify the legal position for termination or reduction of salary of employees during lockdown? Is there any difference between workmen and white collar employees? Please give your.
Okay, I will be very honest. Labor law is not my forte, so I would not even hazard a guess here. There are people who specialize in labor law. I wouldn't want to stick my neck out, but that's a very important question. Please check with some experts in labor law. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
Right. Many people are asking about the presentation that you have clarified, that you will provide to us, and then we'll share.
Okay,
Then
there is one
another
question I'm able to read. What happened if there is a delay in performance interim? However, parties are in arguments to decide the ownership of the delay on completion date of the contract, and how does the current scenario will apply? Okay, if the delay has already happened in the past and you are now in the force majeure regime, irrespective, force majeure will not be a defense for you. That delay that happened, whether contributable to you or the counterparty, will get automatically decided subsequently. Because keep in mind, the force majeure event, you cannot say that the earlier event has actually accentuated my force majeure problem, because there was a delay then. You should have delivered, like the example that I took, you should have delivered by December end 2019. You failed to do that. The only question is whether the delay was on your account or on account of the counterparty. And therefore, that decision will be subject to the dispute resolution that will happen to an expert body, mediation, whatever else, arbitration, etc. But this 3-4 months of a force majeure period cannot be because the rights have accrued or the deficiencies have accrued. Whoever was at fault, whether you or the counterparty or vice versa, have already accrued, which is a status of fact, and that fact cannot be changed. So I don't think there's an escape there. That doesn't become a defense for you. Okay. Now, GST law currently, I'm reading another question. GST law currently restricts credits on undisclosed supply to only 10% of those disclosed entailing requirement for business to reconcile, etc., in their returns. Business to reconcile the outward supply in their GST returns, and companies purchases, since the undisclosed supplies may amount to COVID. How to overcome this issue? Okay, this 10% issue, there is a temporary respite that the government has given. This 10% provision has been kept in animated suspension for some time. So there is a time period, there's a notification that has been issued that this 10%, you did not worry about it. Whatever credits you have until, I think they have said January, February, March, or whatever, you can ipso facto take it up as you had done earlier on. And after a defined period of time, I can't remember whether it is end of August or September, at that point in time, they'll start applying this 10% thing. So right now, this 10% should not be a big worry for you. But make sure that your counterparties do upload those documents. But in any case, this whole 10% to 20% has been challenged before the Delhi High Court. I'm appearing in that matter for some of you who are aware of that. We will see how the courts take up the matter as and when it comes up. Unfortunately, it was supposed to be listed in May, but I don't think the hearing will happen in May. But as and when things happen, Delhi High Court will probably expect some resolution on that 10% issue.
So we can have last question.
Okay, there is a question. Thanks for saying in clear terms that COVID-19 and lockdown are two distinct force majeure events, even though they might be consequent. Yeah, thank you very much. I welcome your suggestion. Yeah, point. Absolutely, they are two different things.
So rest of the questions, I would request the attendees to write to us, and we will pass on the same to Mr. Ghosh. And so this brings us to the end of this webinar. And I, Ankit Raghav, on behalf of ASSOCHAM, would like to convey my sincere thanks to all the attendees for sparing their precious time and joining this well-timed, informative webinar. I would also like to thank Mr. Ghosh for sharing his expertise, invaluable knowledge with all of us on this important topic. Thank you all once again. Have a nice time ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, thank you. Harinder?